The day was nearly spent, the sun sinking low enough to lay long shadows across the brittle grass. Elias Cooper stood on his porch, one boot on the step, the other planted on the warped boards, a tin cup of coffee warming his hand. The air had that brittle, hollow quiet that came before night on the plains. Nothing moved except the grass bowing under the wind, and the occasional tumbleweed tumbling away into the distance. He let his gaze drift to the far edge of the land, where the sky bruised from gold to a deepening purple. That was when he saw her, a small, bent figure, fighting the wind. She was wrapped in what might once have been a shawl, now torn at the edges, the fabric whipping loose behind her. She clutched something to her chest, a bundle held so close it seemed part of her. Step by unsteady step, she made her way toward him, head lowered against the gusts. He didn't move at first. Strangers out here were rare, and rarely harmless. His eyes narrowed, measuring distance, reading her gait. Then just as she reached the porch, her knees buckled. The bundle shifted, and he caught a glimpse of a pale, round face peeking from the folds. A child, eyes half-lidded, cheeks smudged with dust. The woman hit the boards hard, her hands scraped raw and trembling. Elias's first instinct was to let the moment sit, to make certain of what he was seeing. But the child's faint whimper cut through the static in his head. In 2 strides he was beside her, setting his cup aside and crouching down. Her skin was cold through the fabric, her breathing shallow. Without another thought, he gathered her up, bundle and all, feeling the frail weight against his chest. It had been years since before the war, before the grave, that he'd carried anyone like this. Inside, the fire still burned low in the stone hearth. He lowered her onto the rug near the heat, pried the child gently from her arms, and laid the little one close so the warmth could reach them both. The woman's eyes fluttered open for a moment, her lips moving. He leaned closer, catching her. Voice like a leaf caught in wind, Anna. She offered nothing else. He fetched bread from the shelf, poured water into a tin cup. She took them without meeting his eyes, eating in small, quick bites, as if someone might snatch the food away. The child, perhaps 2 years old, curled against her hip, eyelids heavy, one small hand gripping the fabric of her skirt. Elias sat in the chair opposite, the fire casting his shadow large on the wall. He studied her quietly, the hollows of her cheeks, the dirt tangled in her hair, the way her shoulders curved in as though bracing against some unseen blow. He thought of Mary, his late wife, of the fever that had taken her in the spring rains, of the silence afterward, the rocking chair by the hearth that hadn't moved since. Outside, coyotes began their mournful song, carried on the cold wind. Through the chinks in the wall. Inside, the crackle of the fire filled the space between them, each pop of sap in the wood sounding too loud. Elias sipped his coffee, his mind heavy. He had let someone in, someone carrying a story in her silence, and he knew already that nothing about his days ahead would be the same. He sat there a long while, weight of her earlier collapse still lingering in his arms, unsettling. Him in a way he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't fear, not exactly. More like the slow, reluctant stirring of something he thought had died with Mary, the knowledge that a human life could feel fragile in your hands, and that maybe you might want to keep it from breaking. Morning seeped into the cabin in thin, uneven stripes, light slipping through the warped boards and falling across the rug where Anna lay. She stirred slowly, the movement of her arms tight and protective, her hands curved around the child as though she feared someone might try to take him in her sleep. Her eyes opened by degrees, clouded with the residue of too many nights without rest. Elias was already at the table, nursing a cup of black coffee. He had made a second one and set it within reach of where she sat up. She took it with a nod, sipping carefully, the steam curling between them. They spoke little at first. It wasn't the kind of morning for easy words, but gradually. Fragments began to surface. Her husband had been a miner, gone in an instant when a cave-in swallowed his shift whole. She spoke of him with a voice that tried for steadiness but frayed at the edges. The rest of her story came in pieces. In-laws who treated her like a trespasser in her own home, who said the child would be better off without her. They had given her a small sack of flour and the dress she wore, and told her to go before winter set in. Elias listened without interruption, his eyes fixed on the steam rising from his cup. Her tone was measured, the kind of caution a person learned from having their trust broken too many times. He recognized it. He'd spoken that way himself after Mary died, as if every detail was a coin you handed over knowing it might never be returned. When the coffee was gone, he rose to tend to the day's work, stepping out into the clear air. But as he moved, through the familiar rhythm of chores, the heft of hay bales, the metallic clank of a water pail, his mind kept drifting back to her. Her presence in the cabin was like a shadow that shifted the light, not unwelcome, but impossible to ignore. Later, as dusk settled, and the sky went from blue to the deep color of cooling embers, he stepped back inside. She was sitting near the hearth, her child asleep in her lap. Her gaze had wandered to the small rocking chair in the corner, the one that had been Mary's. The wood was dry with age, the seat untouched since the day it fell still. She looked away when she realized he was watching, but the flicker in her expression told him she understood what it meant to see something once alive with presence, now standing useless in the corner. That evening she offered to cook. He almost refused. Hospitality wasn't something he asked of strangers, but her voice carried a quiet insistence. Soon the smell of frying bread began to fill the cabin, a scent so familiar it made something deep in his chest ache. It was the smell of mornings when Mary had sung softly over the stove, of evenings when the wind rattled the windows and there had been laughter in the small space. Elias sat at the table, watching the firelight catch on the loose strands of Anna's hair. Without thinking, he spoke Mary's name, a simple slip, a habit long buried. Anna froze, her hands stilling over the pan. The silence that followed was not sharp but heavy, like a door closing slowly between them. She finished cooking without looking in his direction, set the plate down in front of him, and retreated to the far side of the room with her child. The bread was good, warm, the crisp edge, but the air between them had cooled. Elias ate quietly, realizing he had broken something fragile before it had the chance to grow. She was not here to replace anyone, and he had not meant to compare her to what was gone. Still, her withdrawal told him enough. She's not a wanderer. Resting her feet, she was running, and whatever she had left behind might still be following. And now it had stepped, however faintly, into his home. By the third morning, the horizon had turned the color of tarnished silver, a wall of gray clouds swallowing the distant ridges. The air carried that strange stillness before a storm, when even the wind seems to hold its breath. Elias stepped out onto the porch, scanning the line of the sky, and knew they had only hours. He moved quickly, crossing the yard to the barn, to check the latch on the doors, tying down what could blow loose. Anna appeared without a word, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, a small bundle of kindling balanced in her arms. The wind caught the edges of the fabric, sending it streaming behind her like a banner, but she kept moving, head down, gathering what she could before the rain came. Elias found himself watching her, not out of suspicion this time, but something quieter, harder to name. The first drops hit the roof before nightfall, fat and cold, pattering against the windows. By the time they finished their tasks and came inside, the sky had opened in full, rain hammering the shingles in a steady roar. Elias added wood to the fire until it blazed high, the flames throwing gold over the walls. Anna sat on the rug with her child leaning against her side, the flicker of light warming her face. She was silent for a long while, staring into the flames, and then her voice came low and steady, as if the sound of the rain gave her permission to speak. Her husband, she said, had been Lakota. Their child carried that blood, and in her old town, it had marked them like a brand. People had called her names in the street, spat at her feet. When her husband died in the mine, the whispers turned to threats. She had stayed as long as she could, hoping they would tire of it, but cruelty was something that only grows when fed. She'd taken her child and gone west. Not knowing where she might land, a flash of lightning filled the room for a heartbeat, throwing Elias's features into sharp relief, the deep scar along his jaw, the rifle leaning against the doorframe. He caught her eyes lingering on both, told her then about his own years away the war. the fields littered with bodies, the sounds he still woke to in the middle of the night. He did not try to soften the truth, but neither did he dwell on the blood. Some things once spoken aloud lost their shape and became just another weight you carried. The rain rattled on the roof above them, the wind pressing hard against the walls, but inside the cabin the fire burned steady. Words passed between them more easily now, as if the storm outside acted as a shield, muffling everything but the two voices in that small room. There was no talk of what would come after. No questions either was ready to answer. Just the slow, careful laying down of pieces that might one day make a whole picture at some point. The child fell asleep, his small chest rising and falling against Anna's arm. She smoothed his hair back and met Ilias's gaze across the space between them. In that glance was something more than gratitude, something shaped by the knowledge that they had both survived things meant to break them. It was not yet trust. Not yet anything they could name, but the distance between them had narrowed, and neither made a move to widen it again. The days after the storm carried a strange stillness, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The air was clear and sharp, the ground damp beneath the boots. The evenings came quicker now, shadows stretching long across the yard. Inside the cabin there was a rhythm, unspoken but present. Anna mended a tear in one of Elias's shirts, her stitches small and careful. In return, he fixed the latch on her small trunk, the metal worn thin from years of use. These were small acts, but they hung in the space between them like a rope. Neither dared to pull on too hard. They moved around each other with a quiet caution, aware of the nearness, but not yet ready to close it. Every so often, Elias caught himself watching her as she worked by the fire, the light painting her face in warm tones. And sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, he caught her eyes lingering on him in turn. It was an afternoon like any other until the distant thud of hooves broke the stillness. Elias stepped to the window, pushing aside the curtain with 2 fingers. 2 riders approached from the east, their coats heavy with dust. As they drew closer, he saw the lines of their faces, the set of their mouths. Something in Anna's body changed, her back stiffened, and she pulled her child close with an instinct that spoke of memory. "Not just caution. They're from my old town," she said quietly. Her voice carried no tremor, but her eyes stayed. "On the riders, the one on the left, my husband's cousin. The other," she stopped, "the rest unnecessary." Elias understood enough. These were not men coming for conversation. When they reached the porch, Elias stepped outside, leaving the door ajar, just enough to see Anna's outline in the dim cabin light. Words passed between him and the men, low, hard-edged. They spoke of unfinished matters, of how she'd left without permission, of things they claimed were owed. Elias's answers were short, steady. His stance didn't shift, his hand never strayed far from the rifle leaning by the wall. After a few minutes, the men turned their horses and rode back the way they'd come, dust rising in their wake. The air didn't clear with their departure. The weight of their visit clung to the cabin like smoke. Anna moved quietly the rest of the day, keeping her child close. And Elias found himself checking the windows without meaning to. That night he sat on the porch with his rifle balanced. Across his knees, the boards cool beneath him, the smell of damp earth rising from the ground. The horizon was dark, stars just beginning to show. The door creaked softly behind him, and Anna stepped out, the child asleep in her arms, his small head resting against her shoulder. She lowered herself into the chair beside him, her voice barely above the crickets when she spoke. "Thank you," she said. He didn't answer with words, only nodded once, his eyes on the stretch of land ahead. But the quiet that settled between them was different from the cold silences of days past. This one carried something else, a thread of understanding, of having stood on the same side of an unseen line. Elias knew, without speaking it aloud, that he'd already chosen that side, and there would be no turning from it. Another week slipped by, marked not by any grand event, but by the small changes that settled quietly into the cabin. Anna began to hum while she worked low, unhurried tunes that seemed to rise naturally from her as she peeled potatoes or folded laundry by the fire. Elias had not heard a woman's voice in song within these walls in years. And though she never sang loud, The sounds seemed to fill spaces that had long gone hollow. Her child had taken to building small towers of wooden blocks near the hearth. On a cold afternoon, while fixing a broken harness in the barn, Elias found a piece of scrap wood with a shape to it. He whittled it down in the evenings, smoothing edges until it became a small horse, rough but sturdy. When it was finished, he left it by the fire without a word. The next morning he saw the child clutching it tightly, riding it across the rug in slow, careful gallops. The quiet ease was broken in the early afternoon when the sound of hooves returned. Elias stepped outside to see the same two men from before. But this time their expressions were darker, their movements purposeful. Anna appeared in the doorway, her face pale but steady, her child pressed close to her skirts. The men wasted no time. They accused her of stealing from her in-laws food, clothing, things that didn't belong to her. Their words turned sharper, their claims moving from property to blood. The child, they said, should be raised in proper hands. Elias stepped forward before they could take another breath. His voice was low, but there was nothing soft in it. "He'll take nothing from my porch." The men looked at him then, at the rifle leaning against the post, and must have read enough in his face to know the matter was not up for discussion. After a moment too long, they pulled their reins and turned their horses back toward the east, the cold wind swallowing the sound of their retreat. The encounter left the air charged, as though lightning had struck and left its burn on the ground. For Anna, the moment settled deep, the proof that someone would stand in front of her, not just beside her. For Elias, it was the first time in years he'd felt the old weight of defending something more than himself, and found it was a weight he was willing to bear. That night, the first flakes of snow began to fall, soft against the window glass. The firelight flickered over the cabin walls, and the smell of burning cedar filled the room. Elias sat at the table, sharpening his knife in slow strokes. Anna crossed the room quietly, her child already asleep in the bed. She stood beside him for a moment, looking at the fire, then laid her hand gently on his arm. It was a small thing, no more than the warmth of her fingers through the fabric of his shirt, but the stillness of it carried weight. She didn't speak, and neither did he, yet the touch said more than words could manage. It was the first time she'd reached for him without necessity, and in that simple contact, something shifted. Elias understood then, with a certainty that surprised him, that letting her walk away would not be an act of freedom for either of them. It would be a loss deeper than anything he cared to name. The morning broke, cold and pale, the snow lying in a thin crust across the ground. Elias had barely stepped onto the porch when he saw them, the two riders from before, and this time, third figure in a long coat and badge, glinting at the breast. The sheriff's horse stamped against the frost, its breath steaming in the air. Anna stood just inside the doorway, the child clinging to her skirts, his small fingers curling tight. The accusations began before the horses had even stopped. The men spoke loud, their words sharp with practiced anger. They claimed theft, deceit, and abandonment of family obligations. The sheriff listened with a neutral face until Elias stepped forward, his voice steady as stone. "We'll take it to the judge. Not here, not on my land." Within the hour, they were on the road to town. The snow crunched beneath the horses' hooves, the air so still that the only sounds were the creak of leather and the soft, steady breathing of the child wrapped in Anna's arms. Elias rode just ahead, his eyes fixed on the trail, every muscle taut against the cold and the memory of the men's eyes. The courthouse was a squat building of stone and timber, warmed only by a pot-belly stove in the corner. The judge, a gray-haired man with the calm look of someone who'd seen more trouble than most, listened to both sides. The men spoke first, producing their accusations with rehearsed certainty. When Anna's turn came, her voice was quiet but unwavering. She explained what she had left with the small trunk, her wedding dress, the child's blanket. Elias produced both from the saddlebag, laying them on the table between them. The judge's verdict was swift. "These are not theft. They are hers by right." His gaze moved to the two men, and his tone hardened. "Leave her be. If you set foot on this matter again, it'll be you answering to me." When it was over, Anna rose from her chair with her back straighter than when she'd entered. She stepped into the street with the winter light catching on her hair, her chin lifted just enough to make her look unafraid. Elias untied the horses, helping her mount before swinging into his own saddle. The ride home was quieter than the ride in, but not heavy. Snow drifted down in slow, lazy flakes, gathering on their coats. Midway across the flats, Elias slowed his horse until it rode even with hers. "If you'd rather find your own place," he began, the words rough in his throat. She shook her head before he could finish. "I'm here," she said simply. Back at the cabin, she stepped inside first, the child drowsy against her shoulder. Without hesitation, she hung her shawl on the peg beside his coat. Elias noticed the way it looked there, as if it had always belonged. Later, when the fire was lit and the night settled over the plains, the rocking chair by the hearth moved for the first time in years. Its slow creak filled the small room, and to Elias, it sounded less like old wood and more like a home remembering itself.